forged letters prove you married me only for the property. You must leave for Cornwall at once.
Moving in that strained hush which follows a great ceremony too expensive to be sincere. The marriage breakfast had not yet been laid. The great house still smelled of extinguished wax, bruised roses, damp velvet, and spilled Madeira. Footmen were taking down garlands from the gallery. Somewhere below stairs, silver was being counted back into order. In the corridor beyond her chamber, two maids whispered, then fell instantly silent as the butler approached her door. Mr. Hales entered with a face so carefully emptied of feeling that Corenna knew at once some form of cruelty had already been arranged and merely required her presence to complete it. "His lordship asks that you come at once to the Blue Morning Room," he said. She was 21, newly married by candlelight to Corvin Ashbourne of Ravenscroft Hall, and she still carried in her body the stunned fatigue of a bride who had not slept. Her wedding gown had been exchanged for a pale morning dress, but the marks where jeweled ribbons had pressed her wrists the night before still faintly remained. Only hours earlier she had crossed an estate boundary in law and name. Her trunks had been unpacked into wardrobes not yet familiar to her. Every woman who had embraced her after the vows had smiled as though she were stepping into permanence, authority, and protection. That illusion had not survived the sunrise. As she followed Mr. Hales through the long corridor, pieces of the previous evening flashed before her with an almost mocking sharpness. The ballroom, lit by beeswax chandeliers, the musicians in the west alcove, Corvin at her side, handsome and grave and charming in that carefully measured way which made older women trust him and younger ones imagine depths he had never had to prove. Lady Venicia Hale gliding through the crowd in dove-gray silk, praising the elegance of the match. Mrs. Dacre, Corvin's aunt, telling one guest after another that Corenna's modesty did her credit. Nothing in that performance had warned her, or rather, it had warned her in ways too polished to be named. Corvin had been attentive without warmth. Venicia had been gracious without softness. It had all passed for refinement. In certain houses, a lack of tenderness is simply mistaken for breeding. When she entered the Blue Morning Room, she found not an embarrassed husband struggling towards some awkward explanation, nor even a man made reckless by too much wine, but something far colder, a tribunal. Corvin stood at the hearth in a dark coat already buttoned for the day. Mrs. Dacre sat beside the escritoire near the window, hands folded over a handkerchief she had not yet needed. Lady Venicia Hale stood at the tea table as though she had drifted there by accident and been detained by sorrow. On the polished table between them lay 3 opened letters, sealed in broken red wax. No one invited Corenna to sit. Corvin looked at her with an expression which seemed designed less to reveal feeling than to display the appearance of restraint. "I regret," he said, "that I have been made to understand the full nature of your design only after the vows were said." For one blank second she thought he must be addressing someone behind her. "My design?" Venicia lowered her eyes with practiced reluctance, as if the shame of others wearied her delicate conscience. "These letters," Corvin said, touching the papers with 2 fingers, "were sent anonymously, though the hand has now been identified. They indicate that your marriage to me was urged not from affection, regard, or even family duty, but from a scheme to secure Ravenscroft against the collapse of your uncle's debts. There is mention of your feigned gentleness, your studied innocence, and your intention to bind me in public esteem while your relations gradually placed claims upon my lands." Corenna stared at him. If the accusation had been shouted, it might have appeared ludicrous, but like many forms of genteel cruelty, it was made more dangerous by the composure of its delivery. Mrs. Dacre looked grieved. Venicia looked reluctant. Corvin looked injured. The room had been arranged so that denial itself might seem coarse beside such elegant disappointment. "That is false." Corvin's mouth tightened only slightly. I had hoped you would spare yourself that. I do not know who wrote those letters. Of course not. Venicia stepped in with the gentleness of a woman laying lace over a wound she had helped cut. My dear, no one is saying you were the principal architect of the matter. Young ladies are often guided by older relations in questions of advancement. If you were persuaded into an unworthy scheme, frank confession might still preserve a portion of your dignity. Corenna felt the floor steady beneath her in that strange way it sometimes does when shock becomes too large to hold as feeling alone. You accuse me of conspiracy on the morning after my wedding, she said, and you speak to me of dignity? Mrs. Docker gave a small, pious sigh. No one wishes for severity, child. Your husband has behaved with uncommon moderation in the circumstances. That almost undid her. Not the charge, but the speed with which everyone present had agreed upon the shape of her guilt. Corvin turned slightly toward the window and back again, as though mastering private anguish for her sake. I will not parade the matter beyond necessity, he said. Your trunks will be repacked. A carriage leaves within the hour for Cornwall. You may stay there with your Aunt Maud until a legal separation of households is arranged. For now, I shall say only that the marriage cannot be inhabited under present circumstances. Cannot be inhabited. The phrase was so precise she understood at once it had been rehearsed. He would not publicly annul her. That might invite examination. No, he would suspend her, married enough to be trapped, rejected enough to be disgraced. Far enough away that Ravenscroft and its revenues remained under his uncontested hand. Venicia gave a delicate sigh. This is all most unfortunate. Corenna looked at her then, truly looked. Venicia's pity rested too smoothly upon her. Her gloves had not once tightened. Her sorrow had no tremor in it. Something cold and bright moved through Corenna's bewilderment, but before she could catch its shape, Corvin spoke again. I will be as generous as honor permits, he said. You will have an allowance suitable to your condition. I ask only that you do not force me into public severity. The threat was tenderly phrased. That, too, was deliberate. She might still have answered in anger had memory not betrayed her then with one final stab. The previous spring, when this marriage had first begun to move from suggestion into certainty, Corvin had stood with her beside the west terrace at Ravenscroft while the orchards were in bloom. He had spoken of mutual regard, of good management, of household partnership. He had not said love. He had said steadiness, respect, future. She had been young enough to think these words might mean the safer, slower form of happiness. She now understood that to a man like Corvin, steadiness meant admiration without inconvenience, and respect meant trust until flattery offered a more convenient story. She said nothing more because she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that this room had not been prepared to hear her. It had been prepared to contain her. If you are drawn to stories where a woman is cast aside beneath the cover of rank and respectability, where forged papers try to bury truth beneath polished manners, and where justice belongs not to the loudest, but to the one who learns how power truly moves, like this video and subscribe to Quiet. Fires of America. By 8 o'clock, she was on the Western Road with 2 trunks, one maid too frightened to meet her eyes, and a marriage ring that felt less like a promise than an iron fact. The journey into Cornwall parish took most of the day. Winter rain drifted in thin gray curtains over the fields. The roads narrowed. Tidewater polish gave way to harsher land, salt-bent trees, marsh wind, and older houses no one kept elegant unless affection compelled it. At intervals, she went back through the morning in exacting detail, the way one worries a sore tooth, not because it helps, but because pain feels less humiliating when examined closely. The letters had been already opened when she entered. Corvin had not handed them to her. Mrs. Dacre had not once asked whether she recognized the hand. Venicia had offered confession before evidence. Even the butler's expression had not been shock, but obedience. By the second hour of travel, grief had begun to harden into something narrower and more dangerous. Aunt Maud lived at Blackthorn House, a weather-beaten residence on a rise above the marsh roads, half respectable and half whispered over. Children adored her. Vicars distrusted her. Widows consulted her. Men of rigid principle called her peculiar because she laughed at them without lowering her voice. She came out before the carriage had fully stopped, shawl slipping from one shoulder, cap askew, a spaniel circling her boots in indignation. "Why have they sent you to me before noon?" she demanded. "Has someone died, seduced the help, or forged a will badly?" Corenna stepped down from the carriage and, for one precarious instant, nearly wept from the indecency of being greeted by honesty. "Only my marriage," she said. Maud's face sharpened at once. "Good. That can sometimes be mended. Men are harder." Inside, before the kitchen fire, with broth forced into her hands and the maid dismissed upstairs, Corenna told the story as plainly as she could. She repeated the charge, the letters, the allowance, the removal, the practiced sorrow in Venetia's face, the phrase, "cannot be inhabited," and the curious completeness of the trap. Maud listened without interruption, except once when she muttered, "Ah, that woman again," with enough venom to make the words linger in the rafters. When the account was done, Maud set down her spoon. "Those letters are false," she said. "Yes, I know." Corenna looked up. "Because if your mother's people had wished to trap a husband for land," Maud said, "they would have selected a richer fool and managed it with fewer witnesses." Despite everything, a broken laugh escaped Corenna. "That is not comfort." "It was not offered as comfort." Maud leaned back. "Now listen. Venicia Hale has been ruining people with perfect gloves for nearly 20 years. 2 engagements spoiled, 1 inheritance redirected, 1 merchant family hollowed out after she persuaded a widow to sign trust papers she did not understand. Nothing she touches rots quickly. It rots elegantly. You knew this? I suspected enough to dislike her. Proof is rarer than malice. And Corvin? Maud's mouth flattened. A vain man taught from childhood that judgment is the same thing as pride wearing a clean coat. That cruelty struck deeper than pity might have done. For 3 days, Corenna did little but sleep, rise, stare toward the marsh, and fail to imagine a future not governed by humiliation. News traveled quickly in counties built on reputation. By the second morning, Blackthorn House had already received signs that the story was out. A basket sent with too much sympathy. A call framed with too much caution. Silence from people who ordinarily never lacked curiosity. Corvin had not merely sent her away. He had ensured that uncertainty would finish what slander began. On the 4th day, Maud placed a ledger, quills, sealing wax, fool's cap, and an older dispatch box beside Corenna's chair. "If they mean to govern you by paper," she said, "we shall begin there." It was not comfort that saved Corenna. It was occupation sharpened into purpose. At first, she wrote only what memories still held cleanly: dates, names, exact words, the hour she had been summoned, the arrangement of the room, the number of letters, the color of the wax, Corvin's phrase, Venetia's expression. Maud insisted on these particulars with ferocious seriousness. "Fraud grows fat on vagueness," she said. "Starve it." By the next week, Maud had opened old trunks and writing cases long undisturbed. From them emerged parish notices, scraps of correspondence, unpaid invoices, account fragments, margin notes, and the kind of preserved gossip only women accused of eccentricity are ever wise enough to keep. Corenna began sorting names, dates, counties, kinships, marriages, removals, altered settlements, and abrupt reversals of favor. Patterns appeared. A widowed tobacco factor in York County who had amended his daughter's portions after prolonged counsel from Venicia and died 6 months later. A younger daughter sent away after an anonymous note damaged her engagement. A steward dismissed for asking why 2 versions of the same lease existed. A merchant widow who discovered too late that a fund held in trust had somehow become discretionary. In every matter, Venicia herself remained untouched by the consequence, yet close enough to have guided interpretation at the crucial hour. Corenna was not yet healed. She was still waking at dawn with the sensation of cold silk at her throat and the knowledge that her husband had chosen humiliation over inquiry. Yet grief had begun to lose its shapelessness. If sorrow could be given ledger lines, columns, and witnesses, it became harder for it to devour the whole self. At Blackthorn House, transformation came in unromantic pieces. She learned how estate rents were tracked across seasons. She learned which clerks could be bribed with vanity and which with sherry. She learned that women heard more in market lanes than men did in counting houses, because no one believed their listening amounted to strategy. She learned how quickly those with reputations for harmlessness could gather truths no loud accuser ever reached. "Do not sit in your shame polishing it," Maud said when she found her one morning staring too long at the marsh. "Use it." By February, Corenna had begun venturing out again. She called on a merchant's widow whose brother had once hinted darkly at Lady Venicia's interference in a family settlement. She sat for tea with 2 women who disliked Venicia for reasons they called personal and Corenna suspected were financial. At each table, she said less than the other party expected. People filled silence eagerly when they mistook it for innocence. The county, having first pitied and then judged her, began to make a different mistake. It assumed exile had reduced her. In truth, distance was teaching her the machinery by which respectable houses manufactured ruin. Yet her deepest wound still wore Corvin's face. At night, she returned to the blue morning room in memory and examined that hour as a lawyer examines signatures for tremor. Had he believed the letters? Had he wanted to? Had the prospect of being the injured man flattered him more than truth would have steadied him? Had he ever loved her, or had he merely liked the arrangement until Venicia offered him one in which he appeared noble while remaining untested? The answers changed by the hour. None absolved him. Then, in early March, a rider came from Surrey County carrying a letter from Nathaniel Ashbourne. Nathaniel had always been treated within the family as useful but not central, the fate of men who prefer exactness to charm. He handled figures ably, kept copies of things others lost, and had the unfortunate habit of remembering conversations people meant to make temporary. Corvin liked him in public and ignored him in practice. Venicia disliked him because accuracy is the natural enemy of manipulative grace. The letter had first gone to Ravenscroft and only reached Cornwall because Corvin was away inspecting warehouses, and Venicia, perhaps overconfident, failed to catch the second route. Maud broke the seal before asking permission and read half the page before handing it to Corenna. "My dear," she said softly, which was how Corenna knew the contents were grave indeed. "Your husband's house has begun at last to trip over facts." Nathaniel's hand was neat, compact, and wholly unsentimental. He had found, among the late estate steward's stored effects, draft fragments of anonymous letters used in prior domestic scandals. Their phrasing matched the accusations against Corenna with nearly mathematical precision. One scrap bore correction marks in Venicia's own hand. More devastating still, he had secured testimony from an aging copyist in Portsmouth who admitted, under private statement, that he had been paid through Venetia's maid to imitate multiple hands for matters of domestic delicacy. A packet of receipts linked those payments to earlier disputes involving inheritance transfers and one broken engagement. Nathaniel concluded with brutal clarity. If Corvin has removed his wife upon these grounds, then he has committed a monstrous folly and made himself either the most duped or the most contemptible man in Virginia. At Ravenscroft, Corvin opened Nathaniel's packet toward dusk while rain troubled the study windows, and the house still carried the stale grandeur of a triumph that no longer convinced even its owner. He had spent the previous weeks in a condition he would not have named misery because the word suggested humility. He had called it aggravation, inconvenience, fatigue. The household had grown colder since Corenna's departure. Meals became more formal in her absence, not less. Venicia came and went with solicitous composure, always ready to interpret every silence in a manner favorable to herself. Corvin had accepted all this because he had no appetite for examining what his moderation had actually cost. Then Nathaniel's packet arrived, and with it, the first clean blow against his vanity. He read the letter once, then again, then a third time. By the second reading, the room itself seemed altered. Every polished surface reflected back not the image of an injured husband, but of a man so eager to feel deceived that he had embraced slander before breakfast and named the act honor. He remembered Corenna's face in the blue room, not cunning, not theatrical, merely stunned that the man who had vowed to protect her could pronounce sentence before she had even broken her fast. He remembered how swiftly Venicia had supplied explanation for every uncertainty. He remembered the dark thrill, impossible now to deny, of righteous grievance. The letters had offered him something intoxicating, an excuse to remain morally superior without having to become morally brave. That recognition sickened him more thoroughly than the proof of forgery itself. Nathaniel arrived the next evening, mud-spattered and unimpressed. "You believed it quickly," were his first words after greeting. Corvin had no defense fit to survive being spoken aloud. "I believed what I was shown." Nathaniel's gaze did not soften. "No, you believed what pleased your pride." Evidence came later. He laid out the papers one by one. Copy samples, paid notes, prior cases, a folded scrap on which Venicia had changed simple to modest and timid to meek, preferring the language most likely to trap a man who wished to seem discerning. "I sent my wife away," Corvin said. "No," Nathaniel replied. "You sent away the truth because it asked more of you than vanity did." That night, Corvin drank no wine. He signed orders freezing Venetia's access to household correspondence and instructing that several boxes of papers be removed from the south cabinet to the study under seal. By dawn, he was on the road to Cornwall. Repentance arrived in him not as nobility, but as ruin. The journey west was long, wet, and increasingly stripped of excuses. More than once he nearly turned back. Each time some memory rose to stop him. Corenna standing alone beside the hearth, Venicia's smooth sorrow, his own voice speaking of generosity while stripping a wife of home and standing. By the time Blackthorn House came into view after sunset on the second day, his self-importance had worn down into something harsher and more useful. Aunt Maud did not invite him in. She met him on the front step under a lantern, weather cape snapping in the wind. "You have the look," she said, "of a man who has discovered that self-respect and self-admiration are not the same thing. I have come to see my wife. You have come to see the woman you exiled." His throat tightened. "If she will permit it." "That is the first sensible phrase your marriage has yet produced." She made him wait in the front parlor nearly an hour. When Corenna entered, he rose so quickly the chair scraped behind him. She wore plain dark blue, no jewels beyond her ring. Blackthorn House had not diminished her. It had clarified her. There was still pain in her face, but the helplessness he had expected, perhaps because it would have made his repentance easier, was gone. He placed Nathaniel's packet on the table between them. Nathaniel found proof, he said. The letters were forged. Venicia arranged them. There is testimony, drafts, receipts, and evidence of earlier cases. I have read enough to understand that what was done to you was not only false, but patterned. I was not the first fool she guided. I was merely the most unforgivable. Corenna did not touch the packet. I know she forged them, she said, or enough to pursue it. My aunt and I have traced other injuries. Of course you have. Why are you here, Corvin? The question, because it was calm, left nowhere to hide. To ask forgiveness. She did not answer. To say that I wronged you beyond excuse, that I chose speed over truth, vanity over loyalty, and public dignity over the woman whose safety should have been mine to guard. I cannot ask you to forget the morning at Ravenscroft. I would not insult you by calling it misunderstanding. It was cowardice in formal dress. Still, she said nothing. I have already set steps in motion, he went on. Venetia's access to Ravenscroft is ended. Her papers will be examined. Nathaniel is gathering depositions from earlier families harmed by her. But that concerns her guilt. Yours is different. I exiled you under false accusation. I made your place contingent on my mood and pride. If there is to be any possible atonement, it cannot begin with my asking you simply to come home, as if home were still mine to define. Something in Corenna's face changed then, not softness, but attention. Corvin placed a second folded document beside the packet. This is a transfer drafted yesterday and to be lodged, whether or not you ever return to Ravenscroft. It restores your independent settlement, secures Blackthorn House in your sole control for life if your aunt permits the conveyance, and places a portion of my western rents under separate management beyond my interference. If you never wish to see me again, those terms will still stand. Now she looked down. There are further instruments being prepared, returning to you the dowry securities currently merged into Ravenscroft accounts. Nathaniel insisted I either do the work thoroughly or not at all. So you came, she said slowly, not to command reconciliation, but to surrender leverage. Yes. And if I decline you, I will deserve it. The truth of that entered the room like cold, fresh air. Corenna finally opened Nathaniel's packet. She read the copyist's statement, Venetia's corrections, the prior cases. She felt no triumph, only the hard ache of having been right at a cost she had never chosen. When she finished, she looked at Corvin for a long time. I might one day forgive you, she said. But I will not do it tonight because you have traveled hard and speak well. His face tightened once, then steadied. No. You do not have my trust. You do not even have the shape of it. What you have is an opportunity to behave differently for longer than a single evening. I understand. Do you? Because if there is any road back, it will not be walked by speeches. It will be walked by documents signed, rights surrendered, truth spoken publicly, and patience shown without self-pity. He bowed his head. Then that road is yours to name. From that point onward, the story ceased to belong to apology and became instead a question of whether character could survive correction. Spring brought hearings, inquiries, and the slow public unraveling of Venicia Hale's influence. Families, long too ashamed to revisit their own injuries, began at last to speak. A merchant widow from James City produced a settlement Venicia had once helped revise. A former steward testified that he had been dismissed after refusing to replace one page of a lease book with another. The Portsmouth copyist repeated under oath the arrangement by which anonymous domestic warnings were manufactured for private advantage. Corenna attended every major hearing. That was her real transformation. Months earlier, she had been a bride stunned into silence by a room arranged against her. Now she sat with notebooks, copied references, memoranda, and exact questions. She was not there merely as the injured wife. She had become one of the minds establishing pattern, motive, vocabulary, timing, and harm. Men who would once have spoken over her learned quickly that she remembered dates better than they did, and listened without being flattered by tone. At one county inquiry, an attorney attempted to dismiss the anonymous letters as regrettable but isolated irregularities. Corenna asked permission to compare phrasing across 4 cases. Her voice was so calm that the room barely shifted at first. Then she read the repeated turns of language aloud. Studied meekness, feigned innocence, a wish to secure the future of her relations, a disposition too artful to appear ambitious. By the 4th repetition, even those inclined to protect Venicia understood that coincidence no longer served. Corvin testified as well. That humiliation stripped him more cleanly than any private remorse could have done. He admitted under questioning that he had not sought independent verification before removing his wife. He admitted that Lady Venicia's interpretation had shaped his own. He admitted that concern for public image had hastened his decision. It did not redeem him, but it created the first narrow ground on which truth might exist without disguise. Venicia remained elegant almost to the end. She attempted indignation, then delicacy, then selective memory. None held. Too many papers surfaced. Too many prior victims, once isolated, discovered themselves part of a pattern. Respectable society, which had long tolerated her because she wounded others so tastefully, now turned with its usual cowardly speed. By midsummer, Venicia was socially ruined and legally encircled. Some properties tied to earlier frauds were restored. Some settlements could not be repaired in full because time is often the greatest accomplice to elegant crime. But the pattern stood exposed, and in some lives, exposure is the nearest thing justice will ever reach. Corvin completed every transfer he had promised. Blackthorn House passed formally into Corenna's independent control. Her marriage settlement was rewritten. Her personal funds were disentangled from Ravenscroft management. A separate annual income was secured in such a way that even renewed marriage could not erase it without her explicit consent. Only after every paper had been signed, lodged, copied, and witnessed did he ask whether Corenna would consider visiting Ravenscroft again. Not as a wife ordered home, not as a penitent figure restored by mercy, as a woman free to refuse. She returned in autumn. The house looked different, not because stone had changed, but because meaning had. The blue morning room was still there, the same windows, the same hearth, the same polished table on which the forged letters had rested like instruments of surgical violence. Yet this time she entered with Maud on one side, Nathaniel on the other, and no illusion left in her about what rank without truth can do. Corvin met her there and did not approach until she closed the door behind the others herself. "I hated this room," she said. "So do I." "That is not enough." No. She walked once around the table, remembering the letters, the smell of wax, the sensation of being judged before speech had begun. "If I remain in your life," she said, "it will not be by stepping back into the woman you exiled. I cannot be grateful for scraps of justice after being denied its whole loaf." Pain crossed his face, but he did not defend himself. "What do you require?" he asked. Radical honesty, she said. Not the honesty of confession after disaster, the honesty of never staging false dignity again. If you are ashamed, you will name it. If you doubt me, you will ask before deciding. If you fail, you will not hide inside charm. And there will be no room in this house where my safety depends upon your mood. There will not. And I remain free to leave. Yes. Only then did she step nearer. Forgiveness, she learned, is not softness. It is judgment after full accounting. She did not grant it all at once. No worthy thing is restored that cheaply. The months that followed became the true test. Corenna reviewed accounts herself and altered the household systems that had once allowed too much to be hidden behind rank and habit. Corvin learned to ask before deciding, to confess uncertainty before it hardened into judgment, and to stop treating authority as performance. There were failures. Some habits of pride survived like old injuries, but when he failed, he no longer wrapped the failure in principle. He named it. That mattered more than charm ever had. Years later, county people would tell the story badly if left to themselves. They would say Corvin crossed half the colony and won back his bride through devotion. They would say love triumphed over misunderstanding. They would say Venicia, that terrible woman, had nearly deceived everyone. All these versions were smaller than the truth. The truth was that Corenna survived betrayal without allowing it to define the limit of her mind. She made exile useful. She learned the language of fraud. She sat in public rooms no longer intimidated by paper, law, or male certainty. She built a self no forged letter could contain. And when the man who had wronged her finally understood the scale of his failure, she required from him not romance, but structure. That was why Ravenscroft became a home only later. Not because it had once belonged to a husband, not because society preferred reconciliation to scandal, not because apology, however sincere, can erase a morning of elegant cruelty. It became a home because the woman sent away from it returned under terms she herself could bear. In the end, Corenna and Corvin did not rebuild their life upon forgotten injury. They rebuilt it upon memory properly used. Venetia's name became a warning spoken with lowered voices in houses that had once admired her grace. Nathaniel inherited the respect reserved for men who are doubted until proven precisely right. Maud continued to terrify hypocrites and nourish strays. And Corenna moved through Ravenscroft with neither fear nor illusion. She did not mistake peace for innocence. She did not mistake affection for authority. She did not forget what had happened in the blue morning room. Forgetting would have made her smaller, not freer. Instead, she carried into every chamber the knowledge that forgiveness is not the erasure of betrayal. It is the deliberate choice to let truth, once named, govern what can still be saved. A house, she learned, is not defined by the vows spoken within it on one bright evening, nor by the papers cruelly opened on the morning after. It is defined by the people who remain when vanity, fraud, and borrowed dignity have burned away every easier form of belonging. And because she had once been cast out under the weight of a lie, she knew better than anyone what it meant at last to stand where no lie could remove her again.